Okay, so in the previous video we talked about sensitivity, and now in this video we move on to specificity. Let's rewrite that with a less ridiculous S. So we're doing specificity. And I might have spelled that wrong, but you can look that up on Google if you really want to know the correct spelling. I think that's right. And so what is specificity? Well, previously we were looking at the first column, and what we were saying is the true of the actual positives, how many did we get correct? And so at this, so really it's kind of saying at the same time how many true positives compared to the false negatives as well, and it kind of that performance metric gives us the relationship between the true positives and the false negatives, and it tells us that in terms of the true positives, but really it says something about both. It says something about the true positives and the false negatives. And so we get the same thing here. We get some performance metric, and by performance I just mean how well it's performing, and you don't have to think about it like you would in maybe terms of cars, like how well the car performs, how fast it goes. We just mean it in the general term of how well does it do, and we have to measure how well it does, and that tells us in different ways. So we have the true negatives, over the true negatives plus false positives. So that's another equation, and so think about that for a second. It pretty much relates exactly to our previous video, and it just uses a different column and it says something different, but just think about that for a second, what exactly that means. Okay, so here we have the all the actual negative cases. Let's go back to our HIV example. Of all the people that are actually negative, how many did we get correctly? How many true negatives are there? So say we had 10 total. If you add up the true negatives and false positives, if you added up, that was 10, and we got 8 out of 10 correctly with our true negatives. So we'd have our specificity would be 80%, and so that also tells us the true negatives, because if we have 80%, I'm sorry, it tells us something about the false positives, because if our true negatives, if we're at 80% for the specificity, well, all you have to do is subtract 100% minus 80%, and then that leaves us with 20%. So that means that 20% of our actual negatives were false positives. So that may be a piece of information that you want to use depending on whether it's more expensive to have a false negative or a false positive. In the case of an HIV test, well, false negatives, as I mentioned before, are going to be very expensive. At the same time, false positives may be a little expensive, so maybe you want to know some information about them. In our real estate example, it may turn out that false positives are more expensive because you waste your time as a realtor going out to the house, calling other realtors. You may say, okay, there's enough deals out there, I can miss some deals. So I want to know if it's giving me a lot of false positives. That might not be useful. I'd rather have a bunch of true positives and miss some deals than spend all my day running around looking for these houses and investigating them, and it turns out they're not really a good deal. So as you can see, it really depends the situation and the case, whether you want to use specificity and sensitivity, and there's actually a relationship between those, and I'll get into that in one of the next videos. It's a trade-off, and we get once we get into what's known as cost analysis, we'll see that. But for right now, main points to consider are when you have your angle here between, this is your this this relationship. These are the trues in our prediction. So these are our true positives of the actual, the ones that we got correct in our prediction, the true negatives of the actual negatives, the ones that we tested correctly, and we have our false positives. And so these are the ones that we got incorrectly. So and I wrote them in different colors so you can kind of keep that in mind, but always remember that regarding our confusion matrix. And so the first thing I would typically do is when I start working on a problem like this is just draw out your confusion matrix, draw out the actual, the predicted, and then from there you can, and the true positives and true negatives, and from there you can kind of start to derive these formulas and go from there. So in the next video we'll talk about a little bit about the relationship between the two of those.